is CGTN, China Global Television Network. Live from London, this is Global Business.
Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Jamie Owen.
And I'm Robin Dwyer. Our top stories. Kazakhstan's president says demonstrators will be shot without warning as Russian-led troops arrive to end days of protests.
Our other headlines: inflation hits a record high in the Eurozone, with consumers facing soaring prices for energy and food.
An explosion at a workers' cafe kills at least 9 people in China, with more trapped in the rubble.
US hospitalizations surge 50% in a week as Omicron puts health services under severe strain.
And tattoo artists see red over new EU rules banning many of the coloured inks they use.
Kazakhstan's president has ordered security forces to open fire without warning as anti-government protests continue.
In a televised address, Kassym-Jomart Tokayev warned demonstrators against further action as Russian and allied troops try to put down days of popular protest. Nuija Barkil reports.
Burnt-out cars, buildings destroyed, and civilians being killed by police. Until a few weeks ago, Kazakhstan was one of the most stable countries in Central Asia. But what started as small protests against gas prices have morphed into nationwide anti-government demonstrations that have left dozens dead and thousands injured. On Friday, the president risked escalating the violence, allowing soldiers to fire without warning in a bid to stop the unrest.
The counter-terrorist operation continues. The militants have not laid down their arms, they continue to commit crimes or are preparing for them. The fight against them must be pursued to the end. Whoever does not surrender will be destroyed.
Officials say more than 3,000 people have been arrested, mostly in Almaty, the country's largest city and the epicenter of the protests. This police handout footage shows some of those being detained, while one body lies motionless nearby. Those who can are trying to leave the country. This border post with neighbouring Kyrgyzstan, one route to safety.
I've come from Almaty. I was supposed to have a flight to Dubai tomorrow, but I found that all the airports are closed. I tried to go to other airports, but all the airports in Kazakhstan are closed.
The Kazakh government has resigned because of the protests, but the president remains defiant. He says the rioters are foreign-backed terrorists. He's provided no evidence for the claim, but has called in his own international reinforcements, including troops from Russia, now on the ground in the former Soviet state. The European Union, UK and US have all raised concerns about Moscow's involvement, and the UN is calling for calm.
I think for us the important thing is that security forces, whether they are Kazakh or whether they are non-Kazakh troops, need to uphold the same human rights standards, which is to show restraint and protect people's rights to demonstrate peacefully.
Gunshots were heard in Almaty again on Friday, with the possibility of more casualties on both sides. Rising gas prices have fueled a fire here in Kazakhstan, with deep-rooted frustration surfacing after 3 decades of rule by former leader Nursultan Nazarbayev. Despite its vast reserves of oil, gas and other natural resources, some Kazakhs have a burning desire for change. Nuija Barkil, CGTN.
Well, let's talk now to our correspondent Stuart Smith in Moscow. So, Stuart, what more do we know about this military force deployed to Kazakhstan?
Well, the CSTO, which is the Collective Security Treaty Organization, which has assembled these troops, says around 2,500 will go to support Kazakhstan, led by a majority of Russian troops, these elite paratroopers in particular, and they'll be there, says the Russian Ministry of Defense, to make sure there is stability and to try and normalise the situation. These other countries have got involved and sent their forces at the request of Kazakhstan, and a military treaty obliges them to respond with support, including with military support when a country in that alliance feels threatened. President Putin of Russia has been speaking to various countries within that alliance, including to Kyrgyzstan, who has now confirmed they have their forces on the ground.
Troops will only protect facilities important to the state. They will not take part in any rallies, dispersal of rallies or restoring order. Of course, every state has this right, but we are parties to the Collective Security Treaty. We signed and ratified these treaties. Therefore, I think we cannot refuse these situations, especially when our neighbour asks for help.
Communications with Almaty are somewhat difficult. Is there any news emerging in Russia of what's going on?
Yes, so internet access has been incredibly limited throughout the past week in an attempt to try and make it difficult for protesters to organise. We now know that the president has said in some regions of the country the internet is being re-established where it is calm, and it will be in intervals made more accessible throughout the rest of the country over time. There is still a state of emergency in the country, but there is also a national curfew in place preventing people from being outside. And also, it seems with the introduction of these peacekeeping troops that the activity on the streets is now incredibly limited to only a few cities in the country where protests are still taking place.
And Stuart, has there been any public comment from either Moscow or the West on events in Kazakhstan?
Yes, the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs says that it echoes the claims by Kazakhstan that there may be foreign influence in these protests. The United States says it's watching for potential violations of human rights or any efforts by foreign forces to seize control of Kazakh institutions. And we've heard from both the European Union and the United Nations that all involved should act responsibly and with restraint and should refrain from actions that could lead to further escalation of violence. The European Union has called for dialogue, but Kazakhstan says it's not going to talk with what it calls criminals and murderers.
Stuart Smith in Moscow, thank you.
China's President Xi Jinping has commended Kazakhstan's president for his actions in dealing with the unrest. Meanwhile, China's foreign ministry says it rejects any attempt by external forces to destabilize the region.
China has noted that the Kazakh authorities are taking a series of forceful measures to fight violence and terrorism and maintain social stability. China supports all efforts that are conducive to calm down the situation as soon as possible. China resolutely opposes external forces creating social unrest and inciting violence in the region. As a brotherly neighbour and permanent, comprehensive strategic partner, China is willing to do its best to provide Kazakhstan with the necessary support and help it tide over the difficulties.
Bitcoin has slumped to its lowest value since September. The latest fall has been driven by a sharp drop in crypto mining caused by a shutdown of Kazakhstan's internet during the current protests. Last year, Kazakhstan became the second largest country for Bitcoin mining after the United States, following China's clampdown on cryptocurrencies.
The Chinese developer Shemao Group Holdings has become the latest house builder to experience a debt crisis. Its shares tumbled on Friday, prompting the Shanghai Stock Exchange to suspend trading of 3 of its bonds. Shemao failed to make a repayment on a trust loan on Thursday. It's seeking to delay payments on 2 asset-backed securities due this month.
Samsung says its fourth quarter profits jumped 52% compared with the same period in 2020. That's largely due to demand for microchips amid a global shortage. The electronics giant is the world's largest memory chip maker and is estimating a profit of $11.5 billion for October to December, its biggest fourth quarter profit since 2017.
Turkey spends over $7 billion propping up its currency, the lira, last month. According to central bank data, it came after the lira hit record lows to over 18 to the dollar. The central bank also made its biggest ever intervention to support a single company, state-backed gas supplier, Potash, which received $3.4 billion to offset rising energy costs and the impact of the weaker lira. Inflation in the Eurozone hit a record high of 5% in December. It's the highest figure since the single currency was created more than 20 years ago, with consumers facing rising prices for energy and food. Let's talk to our correspondent Trent Murray in Berlin. Trent, record Eurozone inflation figures.
Yeah, Jamie, more cost of living pressures for families across Europe with these numbers. It makes for pretty bleak reading for those trying to balance their household budget. 5% is the headline rate coming in for the month, up compared from the same month last year. Now, that figure, as you said, represents the highest ever on record since the euro currency was created, and it actually goes above the previous record, which was set just last month at 4.9%. The big culprit in all of this is energy, with energy prices continuing to increase because of both supply chain bottlenecks and also other political issues around the supply of gas to Europe. And here in Europe's biggest economy, Germany, inflation is also running very high locally. The highest annual inflation numbers released just yesterday since 1993. Now, of course, many families are probably seeing this news and are quite worried and concerned, but some experts here are saying the full impact of these rising inflation numbers could be yet to come. Now, the Leibniz Institute of Economic Research, a very respected research institute here in Germany, says the sharp rise in natural gas prices is not likely to reach consumers until the beginning of this year, later this month in particular, due to the existence of long-term contracts with gas suppliers. But I think to give you an indication of the concern in the energy sector at the increase of wholesale costs, Uniper, which is one of Europe's biggest energy suppliers, has just secured $11 billion in credit lines from the German government to help weather this unprecedented storm of increased prices over the winter.
So clearly COVID's still a huge economic strain, but Germany bringing in perhaps more measures which may further slow the economy.
Yeah, I think what we will see from these measures, which have just been confirmed in the last few moments before coming on air, is that even more people will be keeping away from the high street, if you will, with the German government ratcheting up restrictions for people wanting to go to hospitality venues in particular. Previously, you needed to show that you'd received both of your jabs of your vaccine, but that now will not suffice. You have to either show that you've had your booster. If you've only had your 2 vaccines, then you will also have to go and get a negative test result in order to go to places like bars, cafes and restaurants. Now, the hospitality industry here had been warning that that extra burden could really put pressure on them as they try to stay open during this difficult period. Already foot traffic is down in a number of key cities because of the existing restrictions. But Chancellor Olaf Scholz, again, just speaking really in the last few moments, he said that Omicron is really going to make the German healthcare system very busy over the coming weeks, and that he's needing to do all he can to help it get prepared.
Trent Murray, our correspondent in Berlin, thank you very much.
Since the start of the pandemic, China's approach to containing coronavirus has differed to much of the rest of the world. Millions have been put under strict lockdowns to break the chain of transmission. International flights in and out of the country are yet to resume on a large scale. Some have questioned whether China's zero-tolerance approach is an overreaction. Others say there's no alternative. Wang Dan is chief economist at Hang Seng Bank. I asked her if China's response to the virus makes economic sense.
So far, the impact of the zero-COVID policy have its pros and cons, and the most negative impact is mostly concentrated in the catering industry and city services. But when it comes to China's economic growth overall, the impact is more positive than negative. Because we know after COVID, China has been relying on export and manufacturing for its growth. And the zero COVID strategy has basically given China the advantage of keeping its supply chain stable. So we knew that the world had the supply chain disruption as its main theme in 2021, but that's not a problem for China within the border of the country.
So tell us more about what sectors have been hardest hit and how.
For services sector, the impact is quite significant and mostly negative. But when it comes to agriculture and industries, especially manufacturing, the impact is quite positive. And for manufacturing, like we said, it has been probably one of the best years for China. And that's partly driven by the strong overseas demand, but partly also because of the zero COVID strategy.
And what are the economic advantages of maintaining the policy?
I do have quite mixed feelings about this strategy, because when you look at the economic cost, it's mostly being borne by individual families and by the communities that have been impacted the most, especially for the city like Wuhan and Xi'an, especially those people are in the lockdown communities, they are truly suffering. But for the overall economy, the zero COVID strategy, I think it's inevitable. It's an inevitable choice. There has to be a compromise between what's best and what's possible. For the Chinese government, and they are well aware of the insufficiency of China's hospital system. And in the first 100 days of Wuhan situation, when the COVID first started, there was a serious run on the healthcare system, and there was a loss of control situation going on for quite a long time. So for myself, I live in Shanghai right now. Even without many COVID cases, most hospitals are quite crowded. So I cannot really imagine an alternative strategy that by opening the border or just by a free flow of people in and out of the country, it's going to cost the government's capacity to control other situations, like guarantee the supply for the most needed, and also to ensure the labor market security for the low-income groups.
We did see some local lockdowns causing stoppages at ports in China. What are the implications for the global supply chain if those continue?
The global supply chain has been really affected by the disruption in transportation. So far, the biggest hurdle for China's export and production is in fact not in terms of production, but in terms of shipping. The shipping cost has been prohibitively high, and there's no sign of coming down anytime soon. But when it comes to the production capacity and also to supply consumer goods at a reasonable price, China can still guarantee its current order. And we have also seen that the overseas PMI for most Asian countries and for Latin American countries are picking up pace, which means the supply chain in those countries are also improving. The world is probably going to depend on China's supply for quite a bit longer time. We anticipate probably at least for the first half of this year, China will still be the manufacturing center for industrial goods and consumer goods. But in the later half of this year, probably the other part of the world can pick up in their supply.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, an explosion at a workers' cafe kills at least 9 people in China, with more trapped in the rubble.
Search CGTN Europe wherever you get your podcasts to subscribe to The Agenda podcast. The Agenda with me, Stephen Cole, always gets to the heart of the story. Just subscribe today and listen now.
Events have consequences. Words create impact.
One more offensive in a long line of battles that's been ongoing for more...
Just got to be careful here with some gunshots. Excuse us.
The world today matters for your world tomorrow.
The number of casualties is growing quickly.
Why, this is one of the hardest hit towns in the region.
The world today, every day on CGTN.
Facing the unknown is always difficult. In a world in turmoil, it's easy to lose orientation. But when the storms come, we have to see the possibilities. Reinvent. Find new opportunities. Discover a path forward. CGTN. See the difference.
The world has changed under the pressure of the pandemic. For many of us, life is returning to some kind of normal. As we're adapting to changes in all of our lives, let Global Business Europe be your guide to the new normal. Join us weekdays on CGTN.
Beijing, China's capital and its cultural nerve center. A modern metropolis with traditional roots. And now it becomes the first city in the world to host both Summer and Winter Olympics. After 14 years, the biggest sporting extravaganza returns to Beijing. Thousands of athletes from around the globe will compete in over 100 events at 3 zones. Cheered on by over 1.4 billion Chinese citizens and millions abroad. CGTN will bring you a ringside view of the historic event. 2022 Beijing Olympics, the games that matter on CGTN. See the difference.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe.
Coronavirus, the push for green energy and growing security concerns. France is facing a series of big challenges as it begins its 6-month presidency of the European Council. And President Emmanuel Macron will take the reins while facing an election at home. Our correspondent Ryan Thompson reports.
Well, 7 days into the French presidency of the European Council, French President Emmanuel Macron is making his mark, hosting the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen and other EU commissioners here in Paris. He's called for an ambitious agenda in this 6-month term that really will mark a turning point for Europe. Border security, digitalization, and climate change are some of the biggest priorities for this new council presidency. But Friday's meeting also dealt with the security situation in Kazakhstan and ongoing tensions between Ukraine and Russia. Both leaders agreed that the crises provide momentum for closer European cooperation and could be the starting point for a common defense union.
Nous sommes d'accord qu'il faut une véritable union de la défense.
We agree that we need a genuine defence union to prepare us for new threats, whether they're hybrid attacks or wherever they come from. So let's quickly agree on our priorities so we can have a defence position paper. And I'm very pleased that the French committed to this matter. I'm very much looking forward to the decision we will have on it.
Durant ce semestre, nous allons d'abord
In this term, we're going to complete the strategic compass for shared defence in Europe. We'll have a discussion at the informal summit in March and we'll conclude it at that. We'll have a common position in Europe to act more coordinated.
Ça nous permettra d'avoir une position commune en européen ensuite.
But even with a number of policy priorities already on the table, the French term is likely to be overshadowed, at least in the first few months, by Europe's battle with COVID-19 and a surge in infections linked to the new Omicron variant. Ryan Thompson, CGTN, Paris.
At least 9 people have been killed after an explosion at a canteen in the Chinese city of Chongqing. Rescuers are searching for a number of people thought to be trapped in the rubble. Our correspondent Dai Kai reports.
The explosion happened at around midday at a canteen right before it collapsed. So more than 20 people have been trapped. So one person who lived about 100 meters away said it felt like an earthquake when the explosion happened. And we've also learned that the windows glasses of nearby apartments were shattered, so that just gives you a sense of how powerful it is. The cause of the explosion is still under investigation, but is believed to have been caused by a gas leak. The rescue crews arrived on the scene soon as the explosion happened. We've learned that among the first responders, there are local firefighters, medical personnel, and police officers. So a total of at least over 100 personnel were dispatched to the rescue scene. We've also learned that they brought live detectors, demolition machinery, as well as drones to help for the rescue efforts.
Dai Kai reporting from Chongqing in China. Well, as cases of Omicron surge globally, the World Health Organization is warning against describing the COVID strain as mild. But just how worried should we be by this COVID variant? Simon Clark is Associate Professor in Cellular Microbiology at the University of Reading in the UK.
People should be aware that this new variant is highly transmissible. It appears as though, at least in younger people, it doesn't cause so many serious infections as a proportion of the total number. But really, we are still learning about this. We've only known about it for some months, and we don't know what effect it could have on other age groups and particularly on unvaccinated populations as well. So we're still very much in the learning phase with Omicron, and there is still the capacity, potentially, for some quite serious numbers of hospitalizations and fatalities.
As you say, the new data is trickling down very slowly. What do we know? You say what we don't know. What do we know? What are the definite points that we know about the Omicron variant?
Well, we know that it grows within the population much more quickly than variants we've seen before. The exact reasons behind that, I don't think we've got a good handle on yet. We know that the immunity to the variants we've seen before and that is generated by vaccines is perhaps not as effective against Omicron as it is against the other variants. And we also know that, at least in younger people, it is not sending so many as a proportion to hospital or into intensive care.
So will we continuously need to get boosters to address these new variants? I mean, what does the new normal look like?
Well, it depends what keeps cropping up in the future. It does depend on how able they are to cause disease. That's important. And also how immunologically similar they are. So does immunity to one variant give decent immunity to others? We've seen that before Omicron. Will we revert back to that? So it is entirely possible that repeated boosting might be needed, but you may only need it in vulnerable groups if the future variants are themselves not that aggressive in terms of their ability to cause disease.
You know, it feels like we've been sitting here asking these questions for 2 years. The world's been battling this virus for 2 years now. I mean, is there a hope that this year we'll manage to put this behind us and Omicron is the beginning of the end?
Well, people have been talking about the beginning of the end for nearly 2 years now, and I actually think it's quite unwise. We do have to, I think, be prepared that there will be future problems and we'll have to address them. But we're getting better at addressing them as time goes by. I think there will be new vaccines along in due course, I don't know when, that will perhaps be more effective, more long-lasting. But I don't think it's wise to predict the end of this just yet. And of course, if it were to come along, then that can only be a good thing.
Daily COVID infections in the United States continue to hit record highs, with surging cases of the Omicron variant leaving hospitals overwhelmed. They're seeing large numbers of unvaccinated patients, which are infecting many health workers. Meanwhile, one of the biggest employers in the US says it's struggling to meet vaccine and testing mandates and has asked the White House for a reprieve. Our correspondent Owen Fairclough reports.
Doctors at Dartmouth-Hitchcock Hospital in New Hampshire have seen COVID-19 surge after surge, but not like this one. US COVID hospitalizations have rocketed by nearly 50% in the last week alone. And there are profound effects from what medics are calling a surge of the unvaccinated, who are, in turn, creating staff shortages by infecting them.
We can't do what we normally do. We've restricted and almost eliminated entirely elective procedures because we don't have the beds. The beds are full in critical care and other areas of patients with COVID. You know, the typical surgical admission could take maybe 3 days in the hospital. A very typical COVID admission could be 3 weeks.
It's a similar picture across the country. Some hospitals are reporting up to 2/3 of patients testing positive for COVID once they're admitted.
If hospitals are being overwhelmed by the unvaccinated,
then even those who are fully vaccinated are not being spared right now. For employees who catch COVID, it means isolating and working from home, or even taking time off if working from home isn't an option. And that problem is so acute for the United States Postal Service, it's asked the federal government for a 3-month reprieve so it can meet vaccine and testing mandate demands. The Biden administration is deploying military medics to hospitals and some 2.5 million pieces of protective equipment for staff. And while about 62% of the US population is fully vaccinated, millions more remain completely unvaccinated. But the eligibility for booster shots has been widened. Health authorities on Wednesday endorsing Pfizer-BioNTech's booster for 12 to 15-year-olds instead of just those 16 and older. Owen Fairclough, CGTN, Washington.
The Austrian Chancellor Karl Nehammer has tested positive for COVID-19. His office says he's in self-isolation and not showing symptoms. The infection's thought to have occurred on Wednesday following contact with a member of his security team.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead. Masks, testing, jabs and boosters. The controversy over COVID rules in the workplace goes to the highest court in America.
It is now important that all of us in Europe act very swiftly.
Fines for the non-vaccinated will most likely be between $1,000 and $4,000.
The new Omicron variant circulating in southern Africa.
The financial markets have also reacted badly to the news.
Growing dissatisfaction with the way the Dutch government is handling the pandemic.
Cancelling the city's main public Christmas markets for the second year in a row.
Protests and riots by those opposed to restrictions and vaccinations.
There is no room for complacency in this ongoing battle against COVID.
On the agenda with me, Stephen Cole, we look up into space. We look down into data. We look at debt. We look at politics. We look at opioids, climate change. We look at all the issues that really matter around the world. But you matter too. We want to tell the stories you want to see and hear about. Make it your agenda.
The agreement is signed. But what is the real deal now the UK has left the EU? For trade, for business, for the city, for ordinary people. Make sense of Brexit with CGTN.
Ever wondered what's the difference between a bear and a bull market? Where are the cash cows? And who are the lame ducks? And what exactly are black swans? Grey rhinos? And unicorn companies? Make sense of it all with Global Business, only on CGTN.
Hello, welcome back to Global Business Europe with Jamie Owen and Robin Dwyer. Our top stories: Kazakhstan's president says demonstrators will be shot without warning as Russian-led troops arrive to end days of protests.
Inflation hits a record high in the Eurozone, with consumers facing soaring prices for energy and food.
And an explosion at a workers' cafe kills at least 9 people in China, with more trapped in the rubble.
Let's return now to France, taking over the presidency of the European Council. The climate crisis is one of France's top priorities. So let's talk to the environmental analyst Isabel Hilton. Welcome back to the programme, Isabel. So this is Macron's chance to set the agenda for the EU, and the environment is at the top of his to-do list, if you like. What does he want to achieve?
Well, he's got 6 months in this presidency, and he has set out 3 quite important ambitions. He won't get all of them done in 6 months, but he wants to advance them. So his big 3 are, 2 of them are related to trade. There is a thing called a mirror clause that he wants to attach to trade agreements to help avoid unfair competition from imported products that don't conform to EU internal market standards. So that would mean that goods that come into the EU must conform to, in their manufacture and in their supply chains, to the standards, the environmental standards that the EU has set. And the point of this really is to encourage the EU's trade partners and to use the global trading system as a means of advancing the climate agenda. So to encourage the EU's partners to raise the standards and to reward countries and companies that are doing the right thing and to punish violations. So that's an important one. There's a second trade-related measure, which is the planned European Union border carbon adjustment mechanism. And again, the proposals are out there. The discussions will continue throughout the 6 months presidency, but he's very keen to advance it. And the third thing that I think that he holds very high on his list is to set up an EU instrument to combat imported deforestation. So that was one of the big promises, you will remember, at COP26, was to end deforestation. So those are 3 specific things. He also wants to get in place new rules on batteries, which will mandate green batteries within the European Union. And again, that's going to affect trade partners because they won't find it easy to sell batteries that are not so green in the European Union, and of course to advance the wider agenda of the EU's very, very ambitious climate programme.
But the EU countries are, of course, by no means on the same page when it comes to going greener. So what will his main challenges be in getting them to agree?
Well, there's always a challenge in getting 26 countries with very different economies and very different interests to agree on anything. So this is a real challenge. You're absolutely right. There are countries that are simply hostile because they have a legacy. For example, Poland. Many of them are former Soviet satellite countries, and they have a rather toxic legacy of very heavy dependence on fossil fuels. In Poland's case, it's coal. So Poland is always difficult and always wants, quite high levels of compensation. But of course, Macron himself is facing an election in France, and you will remember that the last time French energy prices rose, there was a big revolt in France. The French are never shy of showing their displeasure, and the Gilets jaunes protests caused a bit of a rollback of those. So Macron himself may find internal difficulties with his agenda in the approaching presidential elections. But there are countries. Yes.
Oh, sorry to interrupt you. I wanted to explore that point a little. As you say, Macron, the presidential election coming up for him. Will that influence what issues he presses forward on when France holds the EU Council presidency?
Well, it might well, because, politicians always worry about the next election, and this is quite a big one. It's a second term of the presidency of France that he's after. So it could affect him in a number of ways. I guess it could, if he meets popular resistance to green measures, he could row back a little bit on those till after the election. He could even lose the election to a less green candidate. That would be pretty difficult. Or he may just, again, be very distracted by the election and not focusing as he would wish on the EU presidency election. So a climate agenda. So there are a number of ways in which the internal political situation in France could perhaps slow down the pace.
Isabel Hilton, good to talk to you. Thanks very much for joining us today.
Real pleasure. Thank you.
The US Supreme Court is hearing arguments against President Biden's controversial vaccine mandate. The outcome could affect over 100 million workers. Well, let's talk to our correspondent, John Terrett, watching events for us in New York. John, just tell us the background to all of this.
Well, you know, Jamie and Robin, this is really a story of limited presidential power, because you would assume, wouldn't you, that the President of the United States would be able to say to his people, look, I want to introduce a vaccine mandate. You all get vaccinated up for the greater health of the nation. But it simply doesn't work like that here. Now, the National Occupational Safety and Health Administration, which would enact anything that the President wanted to be done, does have legal powers to protect workers. But the trouble is, everything in America is challenged in the courts, and that's where we are today. So it was back in September of last year that President Biden first floated the idea of 2 vaccine mandates nationally, and they were due to come into force, or they potentially will come into force, it's all up to the court now, on Monday the 10th of January. The first one covers 84 million workers in mid-sized to large businesses around the country, and the other one, 17 million healthcare workers in 76,000 health facilities around the country. And the mandate would require that those people get vaccinated, prove it, or have a COVID test at least once a week. Now, what's happened here is that businesses got very confused about this, and we heard in fact, last package a few minutes ago that the United States Postal Service, one of the biggest businesses in the country, is asking for a stay of execution on putting this mandate into proposition there, because they fear that it will be simply too difficult to enact and will hamper the delivery of the mail. Now, large companies, some of them do have vaccine policies, some simply can't decide, some take the vaccine cards so that they know who on their staff has been vaccinated, but they're not doing any testing because that is a logistical and very expensive nightmare for them. And others are waiting for the final arbiter, which, as always in America, is the Supreme Court of the United States in Washington. And that's where we're at now. Scottus is having a special session on this Friday, and it is crunch time for President Biden's vaccine mandates. Now, what has happened is that business, states, and religious groups have got together to try and squash this mandate and stop it from ever coming into effect. It was blocked by a federal appeals court on the first day after President Biden announced it. It was then unblocked in the week before Christmas, and the plaintiffs clearly wanted blocked or stopped completely again. Now, we can't see what's happening in the court, but we can listen to a live feed. And within the last few minutes, the court has heard from Scott Keller, who is the lawyer representing the National Federation of Independent Businesses, like the Federation of Small Business in the UK. It's the same thing. He says workers will quit in large numbers if these mandates come into effect, and he's looking for an extraordinary stay of execution. And then either Justice Sotomayor or Justice Kagan, I couldn't tell which it was because we can only hear, as I've explained. She said, what is irrational about rules in the workplace when the workplace is where you will be most at risk? That's 2 examples of the arguments going on at the moment in Washington, D.C. It is, as always with the Supreme Court, very complicated and very much in the weeds.
John, profound implications here for healthcare, and in particular healthcare workers among those affected by this too.
Well, that's right, because the court is hearing 2 separate cases today. I've just described the one affecting the 84 million workers and businesses around the country. The second one affects healthcare workers. So this is a separate case. And this mandate would affect companies that are funded completely or in part by what is known here as Medicaid or Medicare, which is a relatively limited social health program for people of retirement age. And this would affect 76,000 hospitals, nursing homes and care homes around the country. And the key argument against having the mandate for the healthcare system is that there are employed within the healthcare system here very young people who earn a very, very low wage. And actually, some of them aren't that young, but they just earn a very, very low wage. And for an example, these will be people who, in care homes, looking after elderly people, are washing them, changing their bedding and feeding them, that sort of thing. And the argument says that if you bring in this vaccine mandate, there are so many people who are against vaccines here that so many of those people will leave their jobs and there will be staff shortages in care homes and things. Now, we know that thousands of people have already left because of the vaccine mandate potentially coming up. That's not really part of the mass resignation that we've been seeing in the United States. I think there's yet to be a mass resignation within the healthcare sector because a lot of these people are doing caring jobs. But the fear is that there are 10 million open jobs in the US at the moment, and should the vaccine mandates be applied to the healthcare sector, then people will simply leave those low-paid jobs and go and get another low-paid job somewhere else where they don't have to worry about a vaccine mandate. Lawyers for Biden are going to argue, well, look, you know, Omicron is the big threat now. That means potential hospitalizations, potentially more deaths, and, of course, staff shortages, and that's why the vaccine mandate should be enacted on Monday. Guys?
John, thanks for that. John Terrace, our correspondent in New York.
Two-thirds of Republican voters in the United States believe the attack on the Capitol a year ago was an act of patriotism, according to a number of polls. Events have been held across the country to remember the 5 people who died on January the 6th last year. Right-wing groups also held vigils for the hundreds of people who've been arrested. Caroline Malone reports.
Take that house! Take it now! The assault on the United States Capitol, the most recognized symbol of democratic government in the world. 5 people died in the events surrounding January 6, 2021, including a protester who was shot by a police officer and a police officer who was injured in the riots. Members of the House and Senate met to mark a year to the day of what many, especially Democrats, call an insurrection. But polls show two-thirds of Republicans don't view the riot at the Capitol as an attack on the government. They may disapprove of the actions, but instead see it as an act of patriotism.
January 6th, that insurrection, in my view, is kind of a middle event in the story of democratic rollback and the ongoing crisis of American democracy. What we didn't see was a realization across the political spectrum, this is a terrible thing, and we must make sure it doesn't happen again. There are consequences for the people who physically broke in, but not the people planning it. We haven't really solved anything here.
Supporters of former President Trump held small vigils across the US to honor those who've been charged with January 6th offenses. This gathering is outside a jail in Washington, D.C.
January the 6th last year was the greatest day of my life. So that's not the answer that most people expect me to say. The violence that happened, the death that happened, of course, I don't wish that didn't happen, but it did. But the part that sticks with me is the fact that we, the people, that we stood up and we made our voices heard.
At least 725 people have been arrested so far, with the Justice Department vowing to find all those responsible. Now, a year later, there are clear divisions and concern about the future. One recent poll showed that more than 40% of Americans don't believe that President Biden legitimately won the 2020 election. And a majority of people believe an attack similar to the one that happened on the Capitol will happen again. Caroline Malone, CGTN, Washington.
Australia's Home Affairs Minister says tennis number 1 Novak Djokovic is not being held captive and is free to leave Australia at any time. The Serbian is staying at an immigration detention hotel in Melbourne, which is used to house refugees and asylum seekers facing deportation. He was denied entry ahead of the Australian Open due to vaccine requirements. Officials say they're now investigating other players. Renata Vorachova from the Czech Republic has now had her visa cancelled and is in the same hotel.
Meanwhile, in Serbia, Djokovic's fans have staged a rally in support of the tennis star, led by members of his own family. Hundreds gathered outside the National Assembly in Belgrade to protest against Australia's refusal to allow him into the country. The Serbian President, Aleksandar Vučić, has called the situation a political witch hunt.
Britain's armed forces are being deployed to hospitals across London to help ease COVID-19 staff shortages. Around 200 personnel, including military medics, will provide support over the next 3 weeks. Virus-related staff absences in England have risen by nearly 60% in a week.
Senior government officials in Hong Kong are among around 100 people ordered into quarantine after attending a banquet. 2 of the guests have tested positive for COVID. The gathering took place before the rules were brought in. But Hong Kong's leader, Carrie Lam, says she's highly disappointed the officials attended the event.
China has lodged a formal complaint with the United States and Japan after they called Beijing a threat. It comes as foreign and defense ministers from Washington and Tokyo held talks to boost security cooperation, accusing China of destabilizing the region.
Cambodia's Prime Minister has become the first head of state to visit Myanmar after the military seized power last February. Hun Sen has said he will press for a peace plan sponsored by the Association of Southeast Asian Nations.
Tributes are being paid to the Hollywood actor Sidney Poitier, who has died at the age of 94. He was the first black man to win an Oscar for Best Actor for his role in the 1963 film Lilies of the Field. A lifelong campaigner against racial segregation, Poitier's films were initially banned in parts of the United States. He died at his home in the Bahamas.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, a food bin that criticises your food waste and a spoon that gives you a bit of a shock. All on the menu at the world's largest personal electronics show.
Each day, there are millions of stories. Each one can open new perspectives, new possibilities. Wherever you look, we are there. To see, discover, explore. We put the pieces together to find what really matters to you. All around the world, all around the clock. Our reporters are at home across the globe. From our headquarters in Beijing and production centers in Washington, Nairobi, and London, China Global Television Network. Stories from across the globe, reaching people across the globe. CGTN. See the difference.
Mari, what would you say is a good question?
Stephen, I'd say it's one where there's always more than one answer.
The Answers Project is a new podcast series from CGTN Europe. With me, Stephen Cole.
And me, Mari Beveridge. In each episode, we'll take a complex question.
And with the help of some of the world's foremost experts, shine light on some of the answers. So join us for The Answers Project.
Available wherever you get your podcasts.
Hello, welcome back to Global Business Europe. A European Union ban on many inks used by tattoo artists has come into force. The EU imposed the ban due to health risks from chemicals and a number of commonly used pigments.
But it's causing concern among tattoo artists who say there aren't enough inks which conform to EU standards. Our correspondent Johannes Blechberger reports from Vienna.
Erich Mehnert is fed up. 90% of the ink he uses to make tattoos are now banned in the EU. The few that do meet the new EU safety standards are in short supply.
There's not much available, just a few shades of blue, one brown, one pink, and 4 different suppliers with black. The other vendors couldn't deliver because of supply shortages, which were also caused by the pandemic, of course.
A tattoo artist without color is either out of a job or has to switch to making tattoos with black ink only. There's widespread concern across Europe's tattooing community, but the European Union says it's unaware of any problems.
Nobody has approached us to inform us of such shortages, and also we have not received any request or complaint that a further derogation is necessary due to the crisis.
EU plans for the standardization of tattoo inks have been in the works since 2015. The bloc says manufacturers have had plenty of time to bring new compliant products to the market and that the rules were necessary.
Certain chemicals which are contained in ink mixtures could be dangerous for public health, and for this purpose we have adopted this restriction.
Scientific research on whether tattoo inks cause conditions such as cancer remains inconclusive. Long-term health effects of tattoos have never been investigated. Erich Mehnert says he's not against regulations in principle, but he believes the way these rules have been implemented could do more harm than good.
Customers will no longer get high-quality tattoos from official providers, so they will go on the black market to get them from non-official providers.
Mehnert warns that so-called backyard tattooists are ordering inks from the internet, which are not subject to any safety controls. He submitted a petition to the EU Parliament called Save the Pigments, with more than 170,000 names.
but it was dismissed by an environmental committee. Blue 15.3 and green 7, these two pigments will also be banned next year in the second step of implementing EU regulation. But tattoo artists do not know how they will be able to work without these two pigments. Johannes Bleschberger, CGTN, Vienna.
Now, a food bin that criticises the amount of food you throw away, and a spoon that gives you more than a mouthful. Just some of the gadgets on the menu at the world's largest personal electronics show in Las Vegas. Our correspondent Mark New reports.
At CES, tech takes on some of the world's biggest challenges. Around 1/3 of the food produced around the world goes to waste. Orbis uses AI and computer vision to capture exactly what goes into a waste bin to provide data that helps restaurants better manage their food supplies.
We can identify up to 1,000 different ingredients, and it can be in different stages. For example, if it's a completed meal, then we know it's already been cooked. We can identify if it's a complete whole broccoli, for example, then it's raw. We found that about 70% is due to defects in their process, that they prepare too much.
Here at the show, artificial intelligence is also entering the world of gourmet cuisine. You remember the replicator in the show Star Trek, where food was instantly produced on command? Well, this is about as close as it gets. Beyond Honeycomb has a master chef first make a dish. Its robotic system then collects data on how that's cooked, measuring everything from its juiciness to richness, then replicates.
So our sensor senses the meat or the meal while it's being cooked to its molecular level, and we digitize the taste and the texture of the meal that's being cooked. Once it's digitized, the AI learns it, and then it replicates exactly the same texture and the taste.
This is the Topagori Chef Edition from the famous movie Parasite. Hope you enjoy.
Made by Beyond Honeycomb's AI system. Okay,
yeah.
try
Replicated Chef Minji Kim's recipe.
Wow, that is good and spicy.
Clearly, it tastes like it's from a chef's hand.
We all know that labor shortage is a huge problem right now, but we are concentrating on the taste itself, not replacing just the human task. We are concentrating on the taste so that people can enjoy food even without people working inside the kitchen.
Making sure meals go down easy is also being addressed from a completely different angle. The startup Taste Boosters has created Spoon Tech, which sends a tiny electrical current to your taste buds through a spoon.
It is the first spoon with built-in electronics inside to enhance taste and to eliminate aftertaste. You can put yogurt, soup, or ice cream on the spoon, and as you eat, it will light up, and that enhances the flavor. It excites the taste buds.
I taste a very sour coffee-flavored yogurt and then try it, activating the spoon. Yeah, the sourness went away.
What we'd really like is for food companies to put less sugar and less salt into their foods, use a spoon like this, and then you could actually eat healthier.
Changing tastes, heightening quality, and increasing efficiency. All goals of the latest technology that's bringing about a food revolution. Mark New, CGTN, Las Vegas.
The headlines again. Kazakhstan's president says demonstrators will be shot without warning as Russian-led troops arrive to end days of protests.
Inflation hits a record high in the Eurozone, with consumers facing soaring prices for energy and food.
And an explosion at a workers' cafe kills at least 9 people in China, with more trapped in the rubble.
And that's it for Global Business Europe. Thanks for watching.
More on all of our stories at europe.cgtn.com, and do follow CGTN Europe on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram. We're on smart TV apps Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire, Android TV, YouTube, Dailymotion, CGTN.com and the CGTN app. And in the UK on Freeview.
Coming up next on CGTN, it's Africa Live. We'll see you again on Monday, same time, same place. From all the team here in London, goodbye.
Goodbye.